In this video, we're going to be taking this photo from this, which is straight out of the camera, to this, which is edited in Lightroom with Pop Candy presets, to this, which is retouched and adjusted in Photoshop to become our final perfected image. So we have this photo here, and it's a little bit overexposed. So I have my Pop Candy presets over here, and as you'll notice, a lot of them just look really washed out right now because they're not intended to have such an overexposure on the photo. But I went ahead and just pre-adjusted this because I knew I wanted to use Lollipop, and I just adjusted it so we would see what it looked like with the proper exposure. And it's looking a little bit too warm and green right now, so I'm going to dial that back a little. To cancel out the greenness, we kind of amp up the red shadows, but we also want the color green back in here, and we want it to be more of a minty color, not so much a yellow green. Same with the blue, it's very washed out right now, and this blue is probably registering as aqua, or aqua as they say in Britain. And it's kind of registering all over the place, so we'll deal with that later, but we're just kind of dialing them in for now. Don't want to sink the red too much, and this doesn't matter because we're going to be manually painting these colors in anyway, and it's not as bad as it sounds, trust me, but you'll see when we get there. And that toning is looking pretty good. Just checking the balance of light and dark. I think their skin is looking a little bit ghostly, so let's drop down the orange a little bit and saturate it. See, the red is also orange, so it's kind of an annoying situation, but I'm worrying more about their skin right now than the red on the canvas. And that looks pretty good, maybe a little bit warmer. This is just me being indecisive, and also we can change it in the end. If I was really editing this as a series of photos like I actually did, I would be comparing it to the other photos in the set using reference mode, which displays two photos next to each other, just to make sure all the colors are consistent. But right now I'm just doing what looks best to me in the moment. Okay, so this aqua now is like really shining out at me. Those are harder to fix than this, so I'm prioritizing that right now. Okay, we are going to right click and edit in Photoshop. You could also export this as a JPEG and edit it in Photoshop separately, but this is how my workflow goes, and we're just going to roll with that. Partially because I like to bring it back to Lightroom, which you do by hitting Command S, and that updates the file in Lightroom, and then you can tweak it further with the reference mode I was just talking about. So, a couple of things that we're dealing with here. We have this wrinkles, and this general unevenness that we're trying to correct while still making it look natural, not like I could have just done this whole thing on the computer. So we want the shadows, we want some wrinkles or some texture, but we don't want it to be distracting and just kind of dirty looking. So before we tackle the wrinkles and this unevenness, I'm going to work on filling this in properly so that we don't have to come back and do what we're doing to this stuff all over again right here. So my first gamble is going to be to use a lasso tool and just see what content aware will do, which I'm not putting a lot of faith in this because I've done it before, but sometimes it actually works out quite well in your favor. The only thing here is I don't want this to be red and this needs to be cleaned up, but that actually was a lot better than I was expecting it to be. So in some cases, I might have to like manually paint this on with a brush, but right now we are just going to I think we'll just do a brush of the white with proper feathering. So I just pressed I for the eyedropper tool, now B for brush, and I want the edges to be like decently hard, and hardness is like how rough or, exact the edge is, versus like really soft is like you can't even see an edge. So we're going to go for like mostly hard. And we want opacity at 100. This doesn't really matter right now because I'm just kind of fixing our template for when we paint in everything else later. So I just picked the white nearest to this section, and by hand I'm using a trackpad. I know a lot of people think that's crazy, and I do too. And let's turn on some smoothing so that it's not as jittery. I use a trackpad because I can't get used to the Wacom tablet type style. I know I probably should get used to a tablet with a pen, but it just messes with me right now. And this doesn't have to be perfect because, this whole thing is hand-drawn anyway, and it's supposed to have that hand-drawn look, but it does need to be, within the realm of visual appealingness, which is a very clunky way to make it say it looks pretty. And then I'm going to just eyedrop this row here because I want to keep it close to where it is. It really doesn't matter. Just cleaning this up a little bit. And this could be done right now, it could be done later. I really expected to spend more time fixing this, so surprised. And let's make this, what's on the other side? Green is, that's not really equivalent. We're going to make it blue. So I'm just going to brush this in, and this is just for the sake of being able to select this color all at once without having to do it manually. And I mean, this one doesn't even have to be highlighted again because I'm painting it in with no wrinkles or anything right now. But I'm just doing it for the sake of consistency. And that's pretty good. So now we're going to use the most magical tool, what I think is the most magical tool. We go to select color range, and this ghostly thing might come up. If you want to see what you're selecting, this is an eyedropper, and it's choosing the, as it says, sampling the colors from an image. So it will literally become black and white, and we want to make it as black and white as possible, and by that I mean no fuzzy edges, and the fuzziness also helps you define that contrast. Like now it's saying, oh, that light blue might be kind of an off shade of white. Oh, now that green might be an off shade of white. We don't want that. We want to isolate the white as much as possible, but we also don't want it to go crazy like that. We want it to just know that we're looking for most whites. And I'm going to hit OK. And then I might also just go to quick select tool and expand the little things it missed. Sometimes quick select tool freaks out and highlights a bunch of other colors, so be cautious of that. And oops, I don't want that. I want to hold down option, which will subtract this. The rest of it is pretty good. So a little bit on our hand randomly. We are going to avoid the areas with shadows because we don't want this to look computer generated. We want it to look natural and not like they're on an illustrated backdrop, like digitally illustrated. We want it to look like they're on a painted canvas, but a painted canvas that's cleaned up. So I am going to now feather the edges. I'm on the quick select tool, right clicking or pressing control click, feather. And I'm going to do about 2. And remember what you choose for the first one, because when we select all the other colors, we want it to be consistent just so the edges all look the same. In terms of how much of a feather radius you should choose, it really depends on a lot of things. It depends on your depth of field. It depends on how computer generated you want this to look or lack thereof. If your depth of field is really deep like this one, where all of it is in focus and there's nothing in the foreground that's blurring out the background, we want a pretty rough edge, a pretty sharp edge. Whereas if I had a close-up right here and all of this was really blurred out, we would want a really soft edge, otherwise it would just look funky to the eye. So for now we want a pretty harsh edge, but not completely computer generated, so we're choosing about 2, and we're going to remember that. So now that I've feathered those edges, keeping in mind I'm avoiding these shadows, I'm going to look for a white midpoint, not the brightest white ever, not this grayish tone. We're going to just go for something that applies to most regions, like maybe something over here. So I'm pressing I for eyedropper, and I'm just kind of experimenting, looking at this thing right there. See, this is really bright, this is gray, it's like a peach. We're going to go for this. And now that we have this selected right here, we're pressing B for brush. And remember, the only thing selected right now is the whites. It's at 100% opacity. We don't really want that. We don't really care about smoothing right now. We are going to do 50. Depending on how much structure and texture you want to maintain to the natural fabric, you might want to go lower to start. Like if I do 20% with 100% flow, oh, and I want to soften this up a little bit. It doesn't really matter, but in case we see any edges within the line, I'm going to just stroke this over a few times, releasing the click each time. And you can see it's slowly fading away with the wrinkles, which might be beneficial, but right now I'm going to undo all that till we see that wrinkle. And I'm just going to go for 50% because I don't want to spend a ton of time stroking over and over. So I'm just going to paint over these little areas, paying special attention to the wrinkles. But you might want to leave some in, you know, so it doesn't look completely fixed. This part's pretty easy. Like you could also just do, what am I doing? Oh, you'd have to be on quick select, control click, and fill with a color. But if we did that with the color we have right now, that will mess these areas up. It'll get rid of the shadows, it'll create a harsh line where we don't want it. So see how, yeah, that's like perfect, but it's almost too perfect. Like if we go, stop lagging out. If we go in here, actually, you know what? It didn't do anything really horrible, but we still don't want to do that. It might have cut off her thumb. I don't remember. But we don't want to do that, especially for the other colors. So we're going to go back to our brush method and coming back up here. And I know that this might be a little bit tedious. That is why I always have, oops, I went too close to the shadows. See that her soul is selected there too. So we don't want to go near that. And that's what the fill thing would have filled when we didn't want it to. What I was saying is I always have a Netflix window up here hovering. It's called Helium. I'm sure there's other programs. And it's not just Netflix, it's also Amazon Prime, you know, all those fun platforms. Just double checking the white to make sure it's not too gray. But yeah, I could not edit like I do without watching something there because it's just grueling, a lot of boredom. And you know what, actually, what I was doing as I was editing this originally, I was changing the whites throughout to kind of keep that natural variation in color that you get from shooting outside. Like, it's not perfect white all around. So I'm just going to keep updating it. And I'm not going too close to them because, again, like if there's any shadows or whatever, I want some of that texture. And updating the white. So now you can see that the white is basically wrinkle-free. There might be still a few spots that just add some natural texture, but it's mostly good. And I should also add that I keep meaning to work in layers, meaning I should have like copied and pasted that selection I had so that I could modify it later instead of like undoing things if I mess up. But I am giving myself credit for taking great strides in Photoshop over the past year, but I'm still not a complete expert. So I should be using layers, you should be using layers, just keep that in mind. I'm just going to do a time lapse of doing all these colors. You get the idea. I'm just selecting each one and brushing over them to get rid of the wrinkles. So now I'm using the eyedropper tool that naturally comes up, and I'm going to do this green, which will mostly select everything. I'm pressing shift to get an additional hue in there. Just any gray areas that don't add anything else that's crazy, I'm selecting that. So that looks pretty cool, and we're going to do that and feather again. Okay, now that we've repeated this process for every color, there's a few more things to touch up. First of all, I'm going to quick select up here because I missed a little spot. Oops, see now it got pink in there. Don't need that. So again, I'm going to feather to keep it consistent. Just going to brush in this little wrinkle. There we go. And now there's some more conspicuous little spots that we just want to fill in with our either clone or heal tool. I'm using heal for now. Oops, it looks like I maybe missed a pink line right here. Sometimes the magic wand tool does a better job of selecting a specific color. Being sure, except when you're on magic wand, feathering isn't as close to the top of the menu, so I get annoyed by that. Oops, wrong color. I should probably select from this one so it's consistent. Okay. And again, if we were working in layers, this wouldn't be as much of a selection problem, but there you have it. And so I'm just filling in these tiny little spots I come across. So the lines are looking good to me. They're looking hand-drawn but clean, and that's what we're going for. The only thing, this is a little bonus tip, I'm going to show you how to change the color of her tights. This can be done two ways. You could select it with the pen tool, which is down here, which is more monotonous because you're just clicking blah 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 until you have it all together, all selected. But I'm going to try the magic wand tool first. And if you lower the tolerance, it's less likely to select things that you don't want it to, but it's also more likely to not select what you need it to. And I think I'm gonna have to do the pen tool because My magic tools can't solve every problem. And sometimes it's more frustrating to like get rid of the bad selections than it is to just use the pen tool and get it right in the first place. So I tend to use a mix between the normal pen tool and the curvature pen tool depending on what's going on with the shape. Like if it's a geometric thing with lots of even curves, I'll switch between them. In this case, I'm just gonna use the regular pen tool. So now that I have this part of her leg selected, I go up here. This has been on path, by the way. I say make selection. Feather radius, let's just do 2 again. In this case, it's a new selection, but each additional selection we do will be add to selection. Now we're going for these little spots. And now I do make selection again, and this time I'm adding to selection with 2 feather. So as you can see, we have our legs perfectly selected, and you can understand why photographers charge to recolor specific items in photos. It's not always that hard to select things because in this case these were just really similar colors all around each other, so it was harder to isolate the legs. But in general, if you are precisely changing colors or, you know, one element of a photo, it's hard to isolate it. So that's why, you know, it takes time, so it's money. And in this case, I forgot to mention the whole reason is that we want it to match this green because in person they were actually more of a teal, but it all kind of blends together and we just want to make sure it's tying into the background. So we are going to go to Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation, Colorize, and this is where it gets fun. I don't know if you've ever done this, but you can like go crazy with this. Like you could literally have them be any color you want. So I'm gonna just try to, oops, that's way too saturated, to match them to the green. It doesn't have to be exact, but you know, we might as well because we're in here. And that looks about good. Ta-da! So there we have her tights green now. So yeah, our photo is basically complete. And now all I would do is press Command S, which brings it back to Lightroom. And now that it's back in Lightroom, we can compare it to how it started and adjust any colors accordingly. For example, now I think the green is a little bit too yellowy green again, so we're gonna just dial it into the mints and slightly desaturate it. And let's see if magenta highlights our pink. And magenta isn't really reading at all. I think the pink is registering as orange. Yeah, so we can't really do anything about the pink. And again, if I had done layers, I could adjust the pink in Photoshop. Now I'm feeling like I undid the green a little too much. But that's basically it. You get the idea. Maybe a little bit warmer. And this is why I like to do the workflow this way, because you can adjust it back in Lightroom, which I prefer for color toning just because I'm more familiar with it. So there we go. I hope this taught you how to soften and clean up a backdrop and even fill in some missing edges. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and follow me on Instagram.